I watched him chop onions and his phone buzzed. I answered, and in 20 minutes our marriage was finished. The kitchen smelled like frying garlic and warm oil, the kind of smell that usually meant comfort, routine, safety. His knife clacked against the cutting board in steady beats, confident, careless. Then the phone vibrated. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small hum that rolled across the counter and into my chest like thunder. I remember the sting in my eyes, not from the onions, and the way my hand moved before my mind caught up. I picked it up. I read it. And in that quiet space between one breath and the next, everything I thought I knew cracked. If you've ever been backstabbed by someone close and dreamed of the perfect comeback like subscribe and comment your story below, this one's going to hit hard. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't even let my face change. That's the part people don't expect. Betrayal doesn't always explode. Sometimes it goes cold. Sometimes it sharpens you. I stood there, listening to the sizzle in the pan, feeling the weight of years pressed down on my shoulders, realizing that trust can disappear faster than steam rising from a skillet. What happened next wasn't an accident. It wasn't rage. It was a choice. Because when someone you've built a life with thinks you're blind, when they believe a single message can stay hidden forever, they forget something important. Silence is not weakness. It's observation. And observation becomes power. I didn't know yet how it would end, only that it would not end quietly, and it would not end with me apologizing for someone else's betrayal. There was a moment, brief, almost merciful, when I considered putting the phone down and pretending I never saw it, protect the family, keep the peace, finish dinner. But peace built on lies rots from the inside, and I could already smell it, stronger than the garlic, heavier than the oil in the air. What followed was not the kind of revenge you see in movies. No screaming scenes, no slammed doors. It was slower, smarter, and when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't just land between us. It landed where it couldn't be ignored. Stay till the end. You'll see how I turned a single text into the truth everyone had to face. By bedtime, he couldn't look me in the eye. And I finally felt free. Morning in our house always came with a small orchestra, the kettle's high, impatient scream, the chorus of cereal spoons against bowls, the muffled traffic hum beyond the curtains. The kids, too small, loud, impossibly bright, moved like little weather systems, scattering backpacks and permission slips, leaving traces of yesterday's crayons on the table. I knew the exact way sunlight pooled on the counter at 7:45, the exact weight of the laundry basket on my hip, the exact rhythm of our mornings. Ritual is a kind of armor. Routine keeps the edges from fraying. He was part of that rhythm. He moved through the kitchen like he belonged there the same way I did, a familiar presence. The man who could always find the missing spatula, the one who made coffee the way I liked it without being asked. There was a gentleness to his hands when he reached for the bread, a small private kindness he reserved for me, a napkin folded into a little sail, an extra piece of toast, a text left on the counter that read, "Lunch is on me today," with a smiley face. We had our dumb jokes, our shorthand, the ridiculous nicknames that still made us laugh at ridiculous times. Those little things stitched us together. Tom had a phone habit. It never felt sinister at first, more like an old tic, a comfort object. He would check when he woke, glance at it during commercials, fidget with it when he was thinking. I teased him about it sometimes. "You and that little black rectangle," I'd say, and he'd roll his eyes and kiss my forehead. "You only hate it because you're jealous," he'd answer, voice warm as a blanket. He would put it face down at dinner or on silent for family nights. Most nights. It felt neutral, harmless. Our life was messy and beautiful in small, stubborn ways. We had mornings where everything clicked, the kids fed, the lunches packed, my emails answered before 8. We had evenings where he would come home with flowers, not fancy ones, usually supermarket darlings that looked like they'd been rescued from a clearance bin, and the kids would argue over who got to hold the vase. We had anniversaries where we ate takeout on the couch and pretended the dimmer switch made the restaurant thing feel real. Those were the moments I kept in a little box in my chest and opened when the day had been too ordinary. One afternoon, not long before the night that would change everything, we were in the kitchen together. It was the small rituals that made it feel like home. A pot of sauce on the stove, basil pulled from a mug like a bouquet, the scent of crushed garlic filling the room until the air tasted like memory. He stood at the counter chopping onions, the knife making that steady, metronomic click, and I was stirring the sauce and thinking about nothing important. The wedding photo on the mantel was slightly askew, a tilt I'd been meaning to fix but never did because some small imperfections were like fingerprints, reminders that life is not staged. The kids were at school, the dog was asleep in her bed, an indifferent lump. Everything was ordinary in that very particular domestic way that makes you trust it. He hummed to himself as he chopped. I said something inconsequential, about a bill, about a show we could watch, about the ridiculous things our youngest said the day before, and he laughed, the kind of laugh that reached his eyes. "Remember when you tried to make lasagna and somehow set off the smoke alarm?" I asked, smiling. He pretended to be offended. "That was only once," he said, "and it was an ambitious lasagna." "You set off 2 alarms," I teased. "You exaggerate for dramatic effect." He flicked a piece of onion at me. "You know I'm trying." We were actors in our own small play, lines worn soft by repetition. The banter settled around us like steam, familiar, safe. I felt the warmth behind my ribs that comes from being seen by someone who knows your edges. I felt the comfort of proximity, the kind of closeness that isn't always loud. It was unremarkable and therefore precious. There were nights, though, when the silence between us was different. Not the comfortable silence when both of us read on the couch, but a hollow quiet that collected like dust in corners. Sometimes his replies to my texts lagged, not just delayed, but oddly shaped, curt, clipped, a sentence that stopped before it finished. An unanswered, "How was your day?" that would sit in my message feed until the next morning. He told me, after a while, that it was work, that deadlines and emails turned him into a different animal. I accepted that answer because it fit, and because I wanted to believe it. Other evenings, he would step out to take a call and come back with hair that smelled like the city or like coffee he hadn't had with me. He would say, "Sorry, it was a client thing," and there would be that brief, almost imperceptible frown conjured by the weariness of a person stretched too thin. I told myself I was imagining things. I was wrong. I let small things be small. A rhythm can hold a lot of fractures if you feed it with enough routine. I had learned to translate the missing words into acceptable explanations. Late nights are work. A short text is a rushed response. A mysterious calendar entry is a misclick. It's easier to keep the world whole when you're willing to rearrange a few pieces to make the picture fit. Still, there were whispers of doubt that crept in like drafts. Once, when the kids were at a friend's house and the house smelled of lemon cleaner, he was distracted at dinner. He pushed his peas around the plate and stared at the window as if seeing someone standing there. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "Just thinking." "About?" "Work stuff." He answered. "It's nothing." He said it with the kind of voice that was practiced, the cadence of someone who is choosing words to make a lie look like truth. I filed it away under stress and told myself not to make a mountain out of what could be a molehill. There were other signs too, tiny and polite enough to be dismissed. A blouse with a faint perfume scent, not our own. An extra credit card receipt from an unfamiliar coffee shop. A screenshot of a sunset he claimed was for a client's post. They were like pebbles in a shoe. Annoying, but ignorable. I walked on. I smiled. I let the small irritations dissolve in the larger river of our life together. When I confided in Rita about those minor, nagging things, it felt less like betrayal and more like a whisper seeking confirmation. Rita is the friend who keeps things in perspective. We met in college and somehow outlived more phases of each other than we should have. She was the person I texted when my mother called, and I needed to laugh instead of cry. Rita does 2 things well. She tells me the truth and brings wine. That combination made her indispensable. "I don't know," I said into my mug one night. the blue porcelain warm against my palms. Maybe I'm paranoid. Maybe I'm reading too much into nothing. It's probably nothing. She didn't mince words. You are not paranoid because you have a pattern. You are worried because there's a breadcrumb trail. Don't ignore breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs, I repeated, because the word felt both ridiculous and oddly accurate. What if it's nothing and I make a drama out of us? Then you have a dramatic story and you'll tell it over cocktails, Rita said, dry and practical. But if it's something, you catch it now instead of later. Trust your gut. Her voice had that steadying quality, the kind that made the loud part of my anxiety quiet down. She didn't tell me to spy. She didn't tell me to rage. She pointed me toward small, sensible actions. Pay attention, document, observe. When she said it, it felt like a plan written in pencil, reversible, careful. I told her about the little thing that seemed silly, Tom leaving his phone face down on the counter and me thinking about it later, a selfie he posted at a work event but without the caption he usually wrote, a tagged photo that felt like it belonged to someone else's story. Rita laughed softly on the phone, then grew serious. You don't have to have proof to trust your instinct, she said, but you should have proof if you want to do something. After that call, I found myself watching him more, in the way I watch a television show I like but don't trust. I noticed the little rituals he did with his keys, the exact way he tucked his shirt in when he was nervous. I started cataloging things mentally, not because I wanted to be suspicious, but because I wanted facts to anchor me in case intuition turned to evidence. There was tenderness in all of this, too. The same hands that flicked onion skins into the bowl also smoothed the crease from my brow without asking. He would text me silly photos from work of a printer he'd fixed or a cup of coffee that accidentally had a smiley face in the foam. He would come home and help fold laundry, and he always remembered to pack the kids' soccer cleats. Those ordinary acts were what made this life feel like a promise. I wasn't naive about human imperfection. I believed in second chances and in the quiet work of staying together. I believed, perhaps willfully, that things could be explained. Still, the unease grew as insistently small as the tick of a clock. I started noticing the way the wedding photo leaned to the left, a detail so small that it felt almost like a private joke with the universe. If you look closely enough, things will tilt. I thought about straightening it so many times and never did. Sometimes we leave the picture slightly off because a perfectly arranged life looks staged. I liked the softness of the imperfection. It made us look lived in. We were leaning into the ordinary that day, basil torn between fingers and dropped into sauce, a timer set for the pasta, the dog's tail thumping against the table when she heard the pantry open. He hummed, and I hummed along, and I made a joke about burnt garlic and hubris. The scene was ordinary in that very particular way that fools you into trust. Then, his phone buzzed. It was a tiny sound, a polite little vibration that you could almost miss. It rolled across the counter and settled on the cutting board like a stone. He didn't flinch. He kept chopping. I felt my skin go taut in a way that had nothing to do with onions. Without thinking, and the way you decide to act before the mind can file the decision away is always the clearest truth. I picked it up. The screen lit like a small sun in my hand. I told myself I'd just be polite. When I opened that message, the words were small and ordinary on a bright screen. I miss you. The phone's light made the kitchen look like a stage. For a second, the world narrowed to those 3 words and the little heart that sat beside them like a secret punctuation mark. The knife in his hand kept moving as steady as ever, but my hands went cold. My stomach dropped in a way that felt like freefall. Quick, stomach first, a hollow where certainty used to live. The garlic sizzled, the timer ticked somewhere in the room, sharp and steady. Time, which had always been a comfort, measured this moment into beats that felt too loud. I remember breathing in and tasting salt. Maybe it was from the onions, maybe it was from my own mouth. Panic has a flavor. It sat on my tongue like a coin. I did what people do when shock arrives in a domestic setting. I kept my voice ordinary. "Who's that?" I asked, as if the question could be gentle and as if casual could protect both of us from whatever came next. He blinked. The kind of blink that happens when someone is surprised by a minor interruption. He kept chopping. Huh, he said. Oh, Lena, she's... He stopped himself. He gave that little chuckle he uses when he wants to make something sound smaller than it is. She's from work. She's fine. Just friends. He said the word like it was a talisman. Friends, I echoed. My voice was in the room, but a little distant to myself, like I was listening to someone else. Yeah, he said. We worked on a project last month, remember? She's just catching up about stuff. You know how group chats get. He sounded casual in the way someone who wants you to take his casualness as truth sounds casual. He set the knife down and wiped his hands on a dish towel. His smile was practiced. I recognized it well enough. I could have swallowed the noise in my chest. I had swallowed many noises before. Sarcasm, small jealousies, the sting of late nights. I told myself a list of reasonable things. Work friends send weird texts. Emojis are confusing. People use hearts now the way they used to use commas. Maybe they were nostalgic, maybe they were platonic, maybe I was being stubbornly modern phobic. I went through every plausible explanation like a menu. Innocent, awkward, misinterpreted. He had been helpful at the kids' school fair, he had stayed late last quarter, he'd taken on extra clients. He was a man who liked attention in easy ways, praise for a job done, a good job on a presentation, not in complicated ones. Those recollections lined up like evidence for the defense, and I wanted to place them on the scale and be done with it. But instinct is a bad listener when logic is trying to talk. The thing about intuition is that it doesn't always speak in sentences. It speaks in body language. It speaks in the way his smile didn't reach his eyes this time. It spoke in the quickness of his wrist when he slid the phone face down on the counter. It spoke in the way he cleared his throat and pretended to be engrossed in a grocery list when my hand twitched toward the screen. After he padded to the sink, humming under his breath as if that could iron the moment flat, I did something quiet and decisive. I checked his messages. I told myself I needed context. I told myself I would find something innocent and then tuck that feeling of unease back into its box. The message thread widened under my thumb like a paper fan. The texts were not pornographic, not dramatic, nothing that would make a tabloid blush. They were banal in a way that made them worse. Late-night, you-free texts, short, bright-spoken messages like, "That was fun today," followed by heart emojis. "We should grab coffee," with a wink. Small, intimate language that had the intimacy of habit. One message read, "Miss being silly with you," with an exclamation point that felt like a private echo. Another said, "Can't stop smiling about today," and beneath it, a photo of Lena laughing in a dim restaurant, her head thrown back, vulnerable and bright. It was the pattern that made the difference. Alone, each message could be read as nothing. Together, they hummed. There were timestamps, after midnight, at 11:42 p.m., at 1:08 a.m. Times when I was sure we had been sleeping, when the house had been still, there were little words that implied a shared joke. We, our. Remember that time. A scapularity of possessive pronouns softened by an amateur emoji. That accumulation was the thing that started to wedge itself into the stable picture I'd been polishing for years. I forced my eyes to the other parts of his phone, the call log, the calendar invitations, the social media mentions. The call log showed a few late-night calls cut short. The calendar had an invite to what looked like an off-site meeting labeled with the company's name. But the location was a bar I knew, and the organizer was Lena. It was petty to be bothered by that, I thought, and then not petty at all. There were gaps in sentences where context should be. There were other people I couldn't place in group threads, names that meant nothing to me. I kept reading. My heart beat a tattoo against my ribs. The hollow ticking of the clock suddenly seemed louder than the sizzle. Sound traveled in the house in a new way, like someone had turned a microphone on. The dog snuffled and rolled onto her back, oblivious. I felt like an intruder in my own life, watching a private show whose script I hadn't been given. When I confronted him again, I tried a different tone. Lighter, almost cheerful. We had friends, we had bills. Maybe I was overreacting. "So they're planning an offsite?" I asked, pretending to be curious about plans. He folded a dish towel with the care of a man who knew how to avoid slipperiness. Yeah, team night, he said. They, wanted to do something informal. Lena set it up. Work thing. He smiled like the word work thing could absolve anything. You've been texting late, I said. He sighed, the kind that signals annoyance at being questioned. I told you. We were going over a presentation. You know how group mates get. He sounded rehearsed. The edges of his voice were smooth. He avoided my eyes. You're sure? I pushed, feeling ridiculous and steady at the same time. Of course, he said. Why wouldn't I be? He said it like a man saying the obvious, and the obvious rang hollow. There was a moment I considered stopping, standing down, making a cup of tea, laughing about the onion jokes we'd shared. I imagined telling Rita an anecdote about a paranoid afternoon and us cracking up, but the images pooled in my mind. Late-night timestamps, inside jokes, the way a name repeated itself in his messages like a new song stuck on repeat. Plausibility dwindled. I did the thing people who need truth do. I looked for small confirmations, the mundane evidence that builds a case. I checked his laptop when he went out to get the mail. I toggled through bookmarked pages, the ones that logged his typical browsing habits. There was nothing salacious, but there were strands. A photo of Lena from a work holiday, a tagged Instagram from a team event with a caption that read, Girls Who Hustle Hearts. There was a comment from Lena under his post 2 weeks back that said, This was a great night, with 3 exclamation points. The interplay looked normal at first until you saw it like beads on a string. You learn to read behavior like a map after a while. The detours, the straightaways, the place where someone chooses a shortcut. The map of his interactions now had routes I hadn't known existed. My hands trembled slightly as I saved screenshots. Small acts like that, screenshot, archive, save, are the plumbing of modern suspicion. They make your intuition concrete. I didn't want to be the person who made mountains out of molehills. I wanted to be the person who had data. So I documented. I labeled files with dates. I wrote memos to myself with short sentences. 11/6, 11:42 p.m. Text, you free? The process felt like preparation for a meeting with myself. The method calmed the tremor. That night, I left Rita a voice note because her voice steadies me in a way that no one else's does. It was late. I could hear the hum of her answering machine in the background of the message, the low electronic sigh that means someone will listen tomorrow. My voice was steady. My words were clipped because there is dignity in measured speech even when your heart isn't. Rita, I said, I don't want to freak out, but look, I found a text. It said, I miss you, with a heart. I let the pause stretch. It's probably nothing, I added. But I don't think it is. There was a beat of silence on my end, the kind that lets gravity do the work. Save everything, she said finally, her voice there like a hand on my shoulder. Document. Don't confront. Not now. Not like that. You need to be careful. Careful how? I asked, needing a plan that wasn't just fear. Watch. Note. Get receipts in a way that won't blow up your life if it's a misread, she said, practical and abrasive in the way friends are when they refuse to let you sit with ruin without tools. Don't make a scene. Don't cry on his shoulder when he expects it. Be quiet. Be patient. And if you need me, I'll come and sit in the kitchen with you so you don't have to be alone. We arranged a meeting for coffee the next morning. A casual check-in, she said. But even as I hung up, I felt a shift inside me. The voice message was a small lifeline. Rita didn't tell me to spy. She didn't advise ambush. She gave me boundaries and a list of sensible steps. It felt like being handed a map in a fog. Over the next few days, I watched for patterns. I kept the phone on a surface where I could see it without touching it. I noticed the way he angled his body when he spoke to me, the slight lean away that made room for someone else. He started taking more work calls. He walked out onto the porch to talk sometimes, and I could see him framed by the doorway like a man who had a private conversation with a private light. When he was home, he was present in the small things, but absent in the weight of presence that matters most. I found more texts, nothing obscene, nothing that would make someone a villain in a courtroom, just a language of intimacy that had nothing to do with my skin. Can't wait to see you, miss your laugh. We should get together soon. Those pronouns again, we, our, that imply history, or at least the construction of it. There was a voice note from Lena one afternoon. I had such a great time tonight, thank you. The simplicity of those phrases made them sting harder because they suggested an ease between them that had tunneled under the surface of our life. I argued with myself in my head. Maybe it was harmless. Maybe it was desperate meaning-making. Maybe I was being ridiculous for reading into friendly words, but the accumulation of friendly words, the timestamps at strange hours, the calendar invite labeled with a blank party location, those things do not scream innocence. They form a chorus that whispers. At work, I started to talk to myself like a detective. I mapped times. I correlated messages with photos. I noticed an office selfie Lena posted without Tom in the frame. Her caption nothing more than late night laughs, not a word about the team. The image itself was small, Lena, at a table with other women, glasses up, brightness in their faces. Tom was not tagged. Tom was not in the photo. The omission was a sliver, a nearly invisible crack. I stared at that photo longer than I should have. The house hummed around me. I tasted salt again when I swallowed. That's when I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. The message that finally cracked the surface wasn't cinematic. It was small and ordinary in the way betrayals often are. A calendar notification at 9 a.m, an event labeled Saturday. Coffee, with a location that wasn't the office cafeteria, but a cafe downtown I knew by habit. One with outdoor lights and a faded chalkboard menu. The organizer was Lena. The invite had an RSVP list that read, casually, Lena, Tom, others. No explanation, no context. Just a polite question of time and place, as if arranging coffee between colleagues was what normal people did on weekends. It should have been nothing. A coffee, a Saturday. But the hours beside the invite were awkwardly late, the kind of mid-morning that bends toward a lunch that becomes a date. My throat closed in a way I'd never felt before, tight and animal and impossible to ignore. I looked at the screen as if it were a map, and suddenly every street looked marked. My chest felt like someone had taken a crowbar to the furniture inside it. The world telescoped, narrowed down to the chair at the kitchen table, to the hum of the refrigerator, to the tiny glitter of dust in a column of light. My hands shook. I remember thinking absurdly about ordinary things. Whether the dog had been fed, whether the kids' soccer cleats were clean, as if small domestic certainties could anchor me when the bigger one had been pulled away. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It slid in like ice water up my spine while my brain assembled reasons. Maybe it was work. Maybe Lena really needed career advice. Maybe Tom had been asked to meet someone who needed a friendly face. Those explanations did not comfort. They sounded like excuses carved thinly and held up to the light. I felt accused of being naive. I felt accused by my own memory of years of loyalty that had once felt like armor, but now felt porous. The conflict inside me stretched taut in a way that hurt. Mother versus wife versus a woman who had always believed she deserved better than crumbs of honesty. My kids' faces flashed through my mind. Trust, dependence, bedtime stories. For a heartbeat, my body imagined the worst. And then, quicker than the worst, the possibility of living through a quiet erosion of everything I'd built. I sat down hard. The chair creaked. I stared at the calendar until the words blurred. My chest felt hollow and heavy at once. The thing about betrayal is that it rearranges trust into a landscape where you are simultaneously cartographer and immigrant. You have to learn the terrain all over again. My internal monologue accelerated into a frantic, looping argument with itself. It's ridiculous, I told myself, and then, not ridiculous at all. You're overreacting, and also you aren't. You're being paranoid, and also you're being observant. You're protecting your children, and also you're protecting your pride. The sentences tumbled together without punctuation, one thought spilling into another until they snagged and split. I went long and breathless, relentless. a river that could not be dammed. Then a short sentence landed like a stone. Breathe. That's all I could do. When he walked into the room, carrying a grocery bag like a man who wanted normal, I felt the most ordinary parts of my life lurch. He smiled in the way men smile when they want to make an ordinary afternoon seem like nothing more than that. Simple, domestic, safe. His hands were warm as he set the bag down. He hummed a tune I used to hum with him when the kids were small. I wanted to reach for that tune with both hands and press it against my face like comfort. I was just adding something to the pantry, he said, casual as a breeze. You good? Yes, I said too quickly. Fine. He cocked his head. He was always good at reading small changes. You sure? You look tired, I said. Long day. His brow softened in that way that suggested concern, and I felt something ache at the fact that he could look at me and not see the rupture on my skin. I tried to speak without a tremor in my voice. Do you have a meeting Saturday? I asked, neutral, like I was asking if we needed milk. He blinked. He paused. The pause was the size of an answer. No, not really. Why? I saw an invite, I said, on your calendar. Oh, that, he said, drawing the word out in a way that made it small. It's just a team thing. Lena set it up. She wanted to chat about next quarter's socials. Honestly, I don't even know if I'm going. His eyes moved in that quick circuit, to mine, away, to the window. People move their eyes that way when they are trying to keep a conversation inside a cup so it won't spill. He said the words with the practiced cadence of someone who had learned how to make explanations sound reasonable. He sounded genuine enough. Genuineness is comforting, like a sweater you pull on because it feels familiar, not because it signals warmth. But that pause had a weight, and the way his fingers flexed around the strap of the grocery bag was a tiny sign I could not ignore. I thought of the late-night messages, the heart emoji, the coffee invite. I thought of the selfie without him. I felt small and big at the same time, small for believing too easily and big for bearing the weight of what might be. We argued. The word is too sharp for what happened. It wasn't a cinematic confrontation. It was a series of short, clipped exchanges that sounded almost polite until the edges bled. Are you going to tell me what's wrong? He asked, genuinely puzzled, which only made the moment sting harder. You know what's wrong, I said. I heard the accusation in my voice and flinched because I did not want that voice to be mine. No, really, he said. You have a calendar invite for coffee with Lena, I said. The words not landed like tiles. On Saturday. I kept my voice even on purpose. I wanted to make each word count so there could be no slippage. He swallowed. It's not what you think, it's just... He searched for the right modifier, like a man reaching for a word in a foreign language. It's just professional. Then why does it say coffee? I asked. Why not meeting? Why not a Zoom? Why is it in the afternoon? He set the groceries down with exaggerated care, as if the movement could slow time. Because it's informal, he said. Some things are better done in person. Why does she text you late at night? I asked. The question came out quieter than I expected. I didn't want to yell. Yelling felt like validation of my chaos. I wanted to stay controlled, to stay deliberate. He balked. We were just going over slides, he said. Sometimes people are in different time zones. It's not... You were texting at 1 a.m., I said. That's not different time zones. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. A familiar gesture, and I felt something that used to be affection cool into resentment. I didn't mean to worry you, he said. If I did, I'm sorry. That I'm sorry landed like a bandage, insufficient and perfunctory, and I could see him flicking the problem away like lint. He expected the apology to be enough. He expected me to smooth the ragged edge. The thing is, apologies built on partial truths have no real adhesive. They peel right off. The room smelled suddenly of soap and citrus from the new dish soap I'd bought earlier that week. It was absurd how domestic odors could be the backdrop to a betrayal's theater. I felt a slow heat in my face. My hands tightened around a mug I'd been holding. The mug was warm, the ceramic rim pressed into the soft skin between my thumb and forefinger. We stood there a long time in a silence that hummed with accusation. The dog wandered between our ankles, confused. "You're making assumptions," he said, as if that were a statement of fact rather than an accusation. "I'm not making assumptions," I said, and I surprised myself by how steady the sentence came out. "I'm observing." His shoulders slackened a little, like a man who had been holding breath for too long. "I'll cancel," he offered, immediate. "We don't have to go. If it makes you uncomfortable—" "No," I said, sharper than intended. "Canceling won't undo the pattern." The pattern. I used the word because it felt less like blame and more like description. It was an argument I could make without collapsing. There was a moment when everything slowed, as if the house had decided to give me the dignity of a frame. The mug slipped out of my hand. Time dilated. I watched it swivel, pivot, tip. There was a single second where the world was a photograph of movement, the mug rotating, the warm coffee gone cool, sloshing, the arc of the liquid. It hit the counter with a soft sound that seemed enormous. I felt my own hand move with the mug as if underwater, unable to stop the fall. Coffee arced and splattered and left a brown fan on the counter like a bruise. He reached out instinctively to help. His hand brushed mine in a way that could have been tenderness, could have been guilt. I didn't answer. The small domestic catastrophe was suddenly symbolic. I had lost hold of something I'd always believed I could keep steady. That night, I lay awake and thought about what justice meant in a world of small, modern betrayals. Revenge doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be destructive. It can be a reclaiming. It can be a strategy. It can be a way to keep your life intact while you demand truth. I could have exploded. I could have slammed doors and thrown plates and called everyone we knew to stand witness to his shame. I could have stood on the street corner with a sign and told the story until my voice was hoarse. Those are theatrics. They are satisfying maybe for a night, but they rarely leave anyone better for it. I thought of my kids. I thought of my mother. I thought of the life we'd built where most nights were ordinary and soft and small, and I realized I couldn't decide on impulse. I needed structure. I needed to build a response that would do the job without blowing everything to ruin. So I made a decision. It was not about revenge in the crude, noisy sense. It was about control. I wanted truth. I wanted accountability. I wanted my family to be protected in whatever outcome followed it. I named my goals because naming is a way of making a plan breathable. Find the truth. Make it undeniable. Keep the kids safe. Avoid theatrics. Preserve dignity where dignity deserved to persist. I wrote these goals down in the Notes app on my phone like someone drafting a brief before a trial. I enlisted Rita without dramatics. I sent her a text that said, simply, "Can we talk? I need help." She replied with the speed of a friend who knows you too well. Be there in 20. She came over carrying a bag with her brisk energy and the steadying smell of coffee she always claimed was better than wine for problem solving. We sat at the table with my phone between us like evidence on a table. Rita's face was readable, concerned, practical, and unflinching. "We don't do anything stupid," she said right away. "We document. We don't confront him in public. We get receipts and backup, and we pick a time that matters. If this is true, it needs to be fought with structure, not emotion." "What time matters?" I asked, and my voice was dry with a fatigue that had nothing to do with a lack of sleep. "An event where there are witnesses," she said. "A work party, a gala, something where a lie will be harder to hold up and where the truth will have more than one pair of eyes to confirm it." I thought of our anniversary coming up, a dinner with family we'd planned to keep small and cozy. I thought of his company's year-end gala, a night when colleagues gathered, when people who cared about appearances would be present. The time-based stake formed like a shape in the fog, a public space, where exposure would not be a private conversation, but a shared fact. The trick was to pick the right stage and the right method so that the truth would not be easy to deny. We sketched the scaffolding at our kitchen table, the lamplight low and the dog curled at our feet. We talked about legal boundaries. None of it should be illegal. And about the ethics of public exposure. We planned to gather screenshots, timestamps, downloads of social posts, a record of the late messages. Rita suggested a backup. A friend who could be at the event, someone neutral who could corroborate what unfolded. She recommended keeping copies off the phone as well as on it, printed receipts, saved cloud folders, email forwarding. The plan felt sensible, like construction before demolition, methodical rather than vengeful. There was fear beneath the practicality. I was afraid of being wrong. I was afraid of prosecuting a man who was guilty only of poor judgment or a flirtation that had not crossed a line I would regret. I was also afraid of being right. If I was right, then we had a house that had been quietly compromised. I did not want to gamble with my children's sense of normal. So the plan was a balance of courage and caution. Find proof, but preserve possibility for healing if that proved the wiser choice. Over the next few days, I moved with a new quietness in the house. I backed up messages. I downloaded photos under fluorescent office lights that stung like cheap bulbs. The glow made the pixels too real and the faces flatter, harsher. The office light washed the color out of things. I watched images saved to a folder and felt the weird intimacy of converting suspicion into files. It was almost clinical, almost comforting. I kept my face calm around him. Normalcy is a performance. Performance is a tool. I learned to laugh at his jokes again, to help fold the laundry, to tuck an extra blanket over someone's shoulder when they fell asleep on the couch. I did this not because I had forgiven, but because a controlled response requires patience. I wanted him to carry on believing things could be ordinary until the truth was inescapable. There were nights I cried briefly in the shower, the water a curtain that hid my soft ruin. There were mornings I stood very still, listening to the house breathe. I rehearsed my words for a confrontation that I hoped wouldn't be theatrical. Facts, choices, consequences. I wrote them down and rewrote them until they were concise and true. And then, in the quiet of a Wednesday evening with a folder of files and a mind that felt both heavy and cleared by resolve, I drafted a message. It was a single sentence at first, the kind of line you might write when you need to force a fracture open. I typed the words and then backspaced. I typed again and erased. The draft sat there like a loaded trap. My finger hovered over the send button. For the briefest moment, I considered sending it to Lena. The thought had the strange allure of immediacy. Quick, satisfying, merciless. But I stopped. There are smarter ways to make a truth land than to hurl it like a stone. I wanted a strategy that would hold up to scrutiny. I wanted an outcome that did not depend on a single impulsive act. I pushed the draft aside. I saved the files. I called Rita and asked her to be at the gala. I asked her to bring an impartial friend. I decided to make the truth unavoidable. I turned detective quietly. There is a particular kind of focus that settles in your bones when you stop arguing with your instincts and start working them. It isn't glamorous. It is paperwork and patience and the dull, steady conversion of feeling into files. I made a list on my phone that night. A short, practical inventory. Screenshots, timestamps, calendar invites, saved photos, witnesses. Then I started collecting. Reconnaissance felt ridiculous at first and then terribly precise. I watched patterns the way someone watches weather, where the wind favors, where it eddies. I took screenshots of the messages I had found, saving them in a folder labeled simply clinically. Dates. I screenshot the timestamps, the heart emojis, the little private jokes that now read like secret signatures. I saved the office selfie Lena had posted, the one where she looked bright and untethered and Tom was nowhere to be seen. I backed up everything to the cloud and sent copies to myself in an email with a subject line that made me feel both prudent and absurd. For future reference. There was more than digital evidence. I started noting physical patterns, too. I sat in my car outside his office one evening and watched colleagues peel off into the building. The seatbelt made that small, mechanical squeak as I buckled and unbuckled, an absurd metronome to keep me steady as I waited. The parking lot had its own rhythms. Who arrived at what time, which cars lingered, which headlights blinked away quickly. I took a photograph of the parking lot clock on my phone, not to stalk, but to anchor times against timestamps. Each click of the shutter sounded like a tiny step forward. The clicking was loud to my ears, intrusive like dryness, but it turned suspicion into a record. Rita was my partner in this. She came prepared in a way that made my plan feel less like sabotage and more like defense. When I whispered over text, "Tonight? Can you?" she replied with the speed of a woman who knows how to choose allies. "Yes. Bring patience and a notebook." Her messages arrived like tempered steel. We stopped talking about fantasies and started talking logistics. How many witnesses do we want present? What constitutes incontrovertible proof? What is ethical and what is theatrics? We agreed on a baseline rule: no illegal activity, no trespassing, no manipulation of devices that were not ours. We would use only what was legitimately in our possession or publicly available. That line mattered to me. It was the difference between vindication and vindictiveness. I told myself over and over that we were not trying to break someone's life for sport. We were trying to make a reality undeniable so that choices could be made in the light. Reconnaissance had close calls. One night, I risked a stakeout that felt worse in my head than it did in reality. I parked across the street from a restaurant where I had seen them tagged in the past. My heart thudded against my ribs in uneven little Morse code as I waited. The seatbelt squeak when I shifted made me flinch. A bus hissed by. For a while, nothing happened. Then a low sedan pulled in, and a figure I recognized, not Tom, but a woman with a similar height and stride, went inside. My thumb hovered over the shutter button. I took a photo before regret could rise in me. In the dim glow inside the car, the pixels looked grainy and unhelpful, but it was another piece to add to the map. The close call that scared me was when someone nearly noticed me. A colleague from his company came out, glanced toward my car, and gave a small, friendly wave. I waved back, my face a practiced mask. For a beat, I felt naked in the headlights of ordinary civility. I could have been the nosy neighbor. I could have been irrational. But the wave passed and life went on. The brief exposure left me more guarded, more careful. I pulled away that night with the same set of evidence, but a new awareness that the line between privacy and proof is thin, and you have to tread it with both bravery and humility. Planning took place in the small hours and across kitchen tables with coffee rings. We discussed how to create a situation where the truth would not be a conversation between two people in a bedroom, but a fact witnessed by others who had no reason to be invested in our private narrative. Rita suggested what she called a workplace moment. That meant a social event where colleagues, people who would not have motive to lie for him, would be present. She suggested the company's casual hour, the end-of-quarter gathering, where drinks are poured and people let their guard down. Pick a place where appearances matter, she said. A place where accountability is almost built in. People remember faces there. The setup needed to look natural. I RSVP'd to the event under the guise of being a +1 a colleague might bring. I created a believable pretext. An email I forwarded to the event organizer with a question about the menu. Nothing odd, nothing that would raise suspicion. I had to balance being present with not appearing like I had rehearsed a scene. It was strange, and yet elegant in its own way, to map an outcome, without staging a melodrama. I prepared props the way a lawyer prepares exhibits. I printed the screenshots and slid them into a neat folder, each page labeled with dates and short notes. I had physical copies because paper has a way of feeling real in people's hands in a way pixels do not. I also had copies saved to a USB drive and an email ready to forward to a trusted colleague if the moment required it. The forgotten package idea, setting down a folder that would inevitably be opened by a curious HR person, seemed theatrical and risky. We rejected it. We wanted clarity, not trickery. Still, doubts returned at odd hours. When the children left for school, I would stand in the hallway and try to feel what it would be to live with the consequences of what I planned. Ethics are not something you decide once and then stop worrying about. They reassert themselves in the quiet that follows a decision. I thought about the kids coming home to an abyss of rumors, about families rearranged. I thought about my mother's face when she heard. Those thoughts were anchors and brakes. They kept me from lashing out like a loose wire. Rita's voice on the phone was my steadying force. "You do this to get answers," she said, "not to punish." The plan hinged on small acts of improvisation. I rehearsed lines that would sound ordinary at the event. A joke about work stress. A question about team initiatives. a compliment delivered with extra sweetness. I would be casual. I would be social. And when the moment was right, I would show the evidence to more than one person without theatrics, with the calmness of the woman who has had time to accept what she knows. The night arrived with a banal kind of storm. Rain as soft as a secret, streetlights smeared into gold in the slick pavement. I dressed in something that concealed both the anger and the exhaustion I felt, a dark dress that let me move without announcing intent. Rita arrived early, harboring the calm of someone who could be both shield and witness. She sat with me before we went in, fingers laced, leaning into the small table like we were conspirators in a better cause. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded. We had our backups. A neutral friend from her book club who would serve as an impartial witness if needed, a printed set of the screenshots tucked into my purse, and the email composed and ready to send to a trusted account should the moment require documentation outside of the room. The bar was warm and loud, the kind of hubbub that makes secrets slippery. People leaned close to hear one another. Overhead lights turned familiar faces into soft halos. Perfume and aftershave braided in the air. The soft clink of glasses punctuated laughter. The room smelled of citrus and people who had spent the day on their feet, and it felt like the kind of human smallness that usually comforts me. I walked in and rode that comfort like a current, sliding into the crowd with a practiced smile. Lena arrived with a laugh like sunlight. There was something about the way she moved, unself-conscious, open, that made people orbit her. She had the kind of magnetism that is not loud yet pulls things into orbit. She hugged colleagues, announced a new campaign with bright enthusiasm, and took a seat where conversation could flow. She wore a perfume with a dry floral note. It smelled clean and indefinably expensive the way scents do, that are meant to be pleasant and not memorable. Tom arrived later with a tiredness in his shoulders, a man soothed by the known rhythms of colleagues but rattled underneath. He greeted people with a smile a few degrees too thin. I let the air do its work, listened to the clink of the glasses, felt the hum of conversation like a net. I made small talk, asked about the project timelines, complimented someone's presentation. I laughed at the right moments. All of it was ordinary. All of it was cover. Then I found him. He was talking with a small group near the back, away from the fuller tables, a safe island. He seemed distracted in a way that was unmistakable. He avoided large eye contact, looked at his glass more than at faces. He was present physically, but absent in the particulars that make people feel seen. I moved closer, with the ease of someone who belongs in a room. I said something light, a remark about the band's set list, and he turned toward me like a man who could still choose how to respond. He started to step away. The instinct to flee situations that feel combustible is almost animal. He wanted to spare all of us discomfort, I suppose, or to move a wedge into the conversation. In that split second, I decided not to let him out of the room. If he wanted to avoid the truth, he would have to do so in public. I approached with the warmest possible tone. "Tom," I said, loud enough to be heard. "There you are. You missed the first song." My voice was a small buoy. It both called him and tethered him to a place where witnesses might be watching. He blinked, apologized, and tried to slide away again. I joked about needing help with the hors d'oeuvres, leaned into the table, and this was the small improvisation that felt like a trick of theater. I accidentally spilled a little of my drink on purpose near his foot. It was clumsy and perfectly staged by design, a drip of red that needed wiping. As he bent to help me, a colleague nearby, invited, neutral, someone who had no reason to defend him, stepped forward and asked if everything was okay. The movement kept him in place longer than he expected. While he was distracted by the small domestic choreography of wiping a spill, I pulled my phone from my purse as if to show a friend a silly meme. I opened the folder I had prepared, not smirking or triumphal, but with the clinical calm of someone presenting research. It was a small thing, a few screenshots, dates, and a photo. I kept my voice even. "Look at this," I said to the circle that had gathered, and then I let the evidence breathe between us. I showed the timestamps, I showed the messages. "I miss you," the casual invitations to coffee, the laughs shared in private. I did not shout. I did not pontificate. I handed the phone around like an object in a museum that demanded to be seen. People's hands, warm and curious, turned the screen. The sound of the band faded under the room's new attention. The faces around the table changed as if someone had dimmed the lights and replaced the scenery without warning. Conversations stilled. The clink of glass sounded sudden. For the first time in weeks, I felt honest exposure, the particular kind of clarity that comes from turning suspicion into sight. Lena's body language shifted. She went from bright to suddenly measured, the kind of shift that happens when someone hears a story and realizes for the first time that they are in it. Her laughter grew small at the edges. She stepped back. Her hands found her phone as if for a shield. For a beat, she floated there like a figure in thin porcelain. Tom froze. The lines in his face tightened. He cleared his throat. His mouth moved in search of a cadence that might reframe what was laid bare. He said something. I don't remember the words exactly because in that moment language became secondary to reaction, but his voice had that particular tinge of someone shocked into self-preservation. He tried to explain, to downplay, to make this a misunderstanding. I had rehearsed what to say. I had also rehearsed what not to do. I did not want to yell. I did not want to make a scene. I wanted witnesses. I wanted people who saw this to remember the faces and not just the theatrics. Someone asked a soft, practical question. Is this work-related? The person who asked had no stake other than being present at an event where a couple of coworkers had become visible in a new, awkward way. That neutrality is a powerful thing. It brought a kind of fairness to the moment. I told the small, calm truth. There are a lot of messages between them, I said. Late at night, private jokes, and arrangements that seem more than professional. I handed the phone back to Tom as if offering him the last word. When a man's own actions are set before him in the light, sometimes his first impulse is to salvage. He tried to salvage. He reached for explanations that were tidy and plausible, but words like work and presentation can only do so much when images and timestamps already tell a different story. The reveal mechanism had worked not because of spectacle, but because of documentation and the presence of witnesses who had no stake in our private narrative. The truth was not a weapon I threw at one person. It was an artifact I allowed others to inspect. That made it harder to dismiss. That made it communal. People turned toward Tom in a way that made him look like the one on display. The immediate aftermath unspooled slowly and then with the terrible quickness of a curtain dropping. Lena's face drained of color as if someone had removed the warmth from her skin with an invisible hand. Tom's jaw unclenched and then clenched again in a performance of a man trying to think 3 steps ahead. Conversations resumed around us, but with a thinness, a kind of polite distance that felt like an invisible divider. I caught glimpses of colleagues exchanging looks, the precise tilt of mouths that says we will not pretend we did not see. I felt vindication, yes, but it was not that feral joy I had imagined in some darker hour. It was a complicated, heavy thing that sat in my chest and made my hands tremble a little. The room was full of people who had no reason to lie for us. That made the truth heavier and, strangely, cleaner. All of this was done under the steady rule I and Rita had agreed upon. No entrapment, no theft of devices, no illegal access. I had used my own observed evidence and presented it calmly. I had chosen a public place where the story could be corroborated by witnesses rather than whispered and dismissed. We had avoided humiliation for the sake of humiliation. We wanted clarity, not revenge masquerading as spectacle. Even as faces turned and mouths moved, I felt the unexpected weight of aftermath. The people who had looked at the screen carried away tiny shards of my private life into their evening afters. Someone would mention it in a corridor. Someone else would whisper it into an HR inbox. The ripple would go outward. That thought made me lightheaded in a different way. Vindication had a cost, exposure, and the knowledge that once truth is shared, it no longer belongs only to the person who suffered. As the night thinned and the bar hummed back to its low state, people drifted away in small knots of conversation. Lena left with a small, polite hug that had no reach. Tom lingered by his coat, making half apologies that sounded like attempts to stitch a fabric with a single thread. He looked like a man trying to piece a puzzle together when several pieces had been removed. Rita stayed close. She did not look triumphant. She looked level, eyes steady and practical in the way of someone who had helped a friend into survival mode. We walked to the car in silence, the rain a quiet curtain. I felt light and exhausted at once. The careful scaffolding we had built had been used. The truth had landed in the middle of a room full of people who could hardly unsee it. That was the end of one phase and the beginning of another. I had wanted clarity, accountability, protection for my children. I had achieved a moment where those things would at least be possible to discuss in reason and with witnesses, but I also felt a strange, slow sorrow that came from knowing that there is no unseeing once you make something public. Vindication and grief can coexist in the same breath. The room had gone silent in the way a sea grows still before a storm. People looked at Tom, then at Lena, then at me. I felt the vindication warm and heavy, and under it, a tiredness that wanted to fold me into bed and not let me think for a long time. What we had done was not vicious. It was adult and ugly and necessary in its own way. The moral checks had been kept. We had avoided cruelty for cruelty's sake. We had chosen accountability over catharsis. Still, as we drove home under the soft hiss of rain, I could not shake the way the evening had ended. There was no fanfare, no dramatic triumph. There was only a deep inhalation of something that might be freedom or might be emptiness. Either way, the truth had been made unavoidable. For a long second, the room held its breath. Sounds thinned as if someone had slid a hand across a loudspeaker. A soft collective intake, a knife-edge hush where laughter had been. Glass chimed against glass as if reminding the world that things could shatter quietly. People's heads turned like slow cameras. Someone's chair scraped back, a small, startled sound that felt enormous. A whisper moved around the room like a cold draft. Faces rearranged themselves into new expressions. Curiosity folding into comprehension, comprehension into sympathy, sympathy into that particular, private kind of discomfort that makes people look away. Lena's face changed in stages. First, she blinked, like someone waking from a pleasant thought. Then, color drained from her cheeks in a slow, unfair wash. Her smile hardened, then fell away entirely. Her hands, always so animated, stilled as if she had been told to hold perfectly still. She searched the circle of faces, eyes skittering for an ally, finding none. For a moment, she looked very young, exposed, not by malice, but by the very ordinary fallout of being seen more plainly than she had intended to be. Tom didn't reach for explanations at first. He froze, jaw working as though he were trying to chew a thought into a shape that would make sense. Then he tried to speak. A quick, shuffling attempt at salvage that sounded small in a room that had turned into an audience. "It's not what it looks like," he said, the tautness of truth and lie braided together in his voice. I listened to the words and felt them fall like cheap paper into a pool of witnesses. They soaked up the light and sank, ineffective. "You didn't just send a text," I said, and the sentence landed hard because I had let it grow inside me until it had weight. "You rewrote the life we promised." The words came out simple and flat, as if naming the injury might be the same as closing it. He flinched, as if struck. He opened his mouth and closed it again. The sound of his silence felt more telling than any explanation he could manufacture. The immediate consequences were practical and dull in the way tragedies often are. Conversations split into halves. Some people retreated into compassion, others into awkward curiosity. An HR representative later wrote a terse email asking to schedule a meeting to discuss employee conduct. The line landed like a rain check on their professional lives. Colleagues that had been casual before dropped small, polite distance into their interactions with him. Lena's social cachet dimmed. Invites became fewer, smiles shorter, introductions more formal. People you work with are mirrors. When something fractures, the reflections shift. That shift matters in a job where reputation is part of the currency. I felt a curious mixture of triumph and emptiness. There was a lightness in my shoulders. The sensation of a weight lifted that I had been carrying subtly for months, years even. The small, constant gravity of uncertainty had been eased, and yet, beneath that easing, there was a hollow like the space left behind by a piece of furniture moved from the living room. The home felt different in the way a cleared room feels different, less cluttered, but strangely echoing. I had wanted truth, and I had it, but truth is not always a balm. Sometimes it is a tool that cuts away what needs cutting. The wound was open. Healing would take time. After the event, we did what adults do in the wake of something ugly. We answered the pressing, mundane questions. The kids came home from school oblivious at first, their backpacks heavy with worksheets and the ordinariness of being children. I made tea on autopilot while the dog nosed my knee as if nothing had shifted in the gravity of the house. It felt important to make the ordinary true for them. Later, when they asked why Daddy seemed tired, I chose words like grown-up trouble and we're talking about it, which are small, honest bridges toward reassurance without unnecessary detail. Children deserve the dignity of protection more than they deserve salacious context. Rita was a rock. She sat with me on the couch in the thick blue of the evening, legs tucked under her, bringing the steady way of someone who knows how to stay present. We didn't scream. We didn't plot revenge. We made phone calls that looked like administrative tasks, a tentative appointment with a counselor, a conversation with a trusted family member, an email to an attorney to understand what steps felt prudent to protect the children and secure household logistics. The language we used was practical. Boundaries, counseling, timelines, accountability. It felt responsible, dull, and necessary. There was a raw conversation with Tom that felt more like negotiation than drama. He tried to explain, halting, fumbling, sometimes honest in small, painful ways. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said at one point, and the sentence was both true and insufficient. I made mistakes, he admitted later in private, the words leaving a small, honest wound. I said things I had rehearsed and others that surprised me with their bluntness. Trust is not an automatic setting, I told him. You took liberties with the life we agreed to. He listened, sometimes looking down, sometimes looking like a man trying to rebuild a bridge board by board. We discussed counseling. We discussed boundaries around phones and accounts and what transparency might mean. We talked about timelines for change and the possibility of separation if trust could not be reconstituted. It was adult and tethered to the real-world logistics of children, bills, and shared history. Weeks followed with small, careful steps. We attended a first session with a counselor whose office smelled faintly of lemon and paperbacks. The room felt like a held space where both truth and apology could practice taking equal turns. We set practical boundaries, shared passwords, while we rebuilt trust slowly, check-ins that were less about surveillance and more about accountability. One-on-one meetings with a therapist to untangle motives and habits. These were not dramatic cures. They were planks and mortar. They felt like work. Publicly, consequences continued their quiet work. HR followed up. Whispers settled into new patterns. Lena's posts tapered off, and one by one, colleagues' invites dwindled to the occasional professional note. Tom's work relationships shifted into a compartmentalized kind of civility that made him functionally present but not entirely trusted. Watching that unfold was complicated. It felt just, and it also felt bleak in its small human costs. I did not take pleasure in anyone's social ostracism. I took relief in the restoration of a kind of order. A few weeks later, ordinary things began to stitch themselves into a new rhythm. We fixed the wedding photo frame, a tiny, symbolic act that felt less about putting pieces back and more about deciding how the picture would sit from now on. I straightened it, deliberately, not to pretend the frame had not tilted, but to show a small, quiet ownership of the space. Morning light pooled where it had always pooled, cereal bowls still clattered, the dog still snored in her floofy way. The children went to soccer, to piano, to school, and the routines that protect them hummed along. At night, the house was quieter. The streetlight sliced across the living room in a straight bar of light. A neutral cut through the darkness. I sat with a cup of cold coffee sometimes. the bitter edge a reminder that some things are best left unsweetened for clarity. I would think about justice and mercy in the same breath. Justice had felt necessary. It had been the lever I pulled to stop a slow erosion. Mercy felt like something I needed to hold in reserve, not as a reward for bad behavior, but as a capacity I might choose if real repentance presented itself and if it made sense for the children and for the adult lives at stake. There is a strange moral economy to these moments. You weigh the cost of exposing against the harm of silence. You choose not just for yourself, but for the people who will inherit the aftermath. If you ask me now whether it was worth it, my answer is not simple. The truth was necessary. The telling of it opened a door that needed opening, but the letting in of light also changes the shape of a room forever. In the end, I kept to the practical lessons I had promised myself. I protected my children. I sought counsel. I measured decisions in steps rather than in shouts. And I learned a fierce truth about dignity, that sometimes reclaiming it requires both clarity and restraint. If you're reading this because you find yourself holding a small, persistent suspicion, know this. Documenting your truth, finding witnesses, and choosing measured action are not cruel. They are adult. They are precise. They are, in their way, merciful to the part of you that deserves to live without doubt. When I look back now, what I see isn't a single moment of triumph or a clean, cinematic ending. I see a series of choices, small ones, hard ones, the kind that don't feel heroic while you're making them, but quietly change the shape of your life afterward. People ask me, was it worth it? And the honest answer is complicated. The exposure brought clarity. It brought safety for my family. It gave me my voice back. But the peace, the real peace, didn't arrive in the room where the truth was revealed. It came later in the decisions I made after, when the noise had settled and I had to live with myself. Revenge, if you want to call it that, didn't heal me on its own. What it did was stop the bleeding. It turned a private ache into something named and seen. It put boundaries where there had been blind trust. It reminded me that self-respect isn't loud and it doesn't need applause. Sometimes it's just the quiet refusal to carry someone else's lies. If you're listening to this and you recognize that tight feeling in your chest, here's what I learned the hard way. Protect your evidence. Not to hurt someone, but to protect your reality. Speak to at least one trusted person so you don't drown in your own thoughts. Think through the consequences before you act, because truth has a long echo. And above all, choose dignity over chaos. Dignity lasts longer. If this story resonated with you, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it tells me these stories matter to you too. Karma isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just the slow rebalancing of power when you stop accepting less than you deserve. Sometimes it looks like silence instead of shouting, and boundaries instead of revenge fantasies. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth and then decide what kind of life you want to build afterward. If this revenge saga gave you that rush of justice, smash like, subscribe for more epic tales, and share your revenge story in the comments. Click the next video box for another one. We didn't end with fireworks. We ended with truth, and that was enough.